Now, some of the key features of our approach to physical restraint is that A, we seek to prioritize securing the subject with what we term a harness, which you'll see shortly, in order to sit them down, and we try whenever possible to avoid putting them on their stomach in a so-called prone position. If we must put them flat on the ground, we seek to put them on their back in a so-called supine position. When bringing people to the ground, there's an entire other arsenal. We will start to overlap from here. If we are alone, we try to prioritize keeping the subject on their side in basically a modified first aid recovery position. And the moment we have backup, we go back to putting them onto the ground, preferably in a cruciform position with the legs bundled and the arms stretched away from the body. These are the governing principles of what we do. We're always seeking to avoid physical contact if we can avoid it, to de-escalate, to detect, to avoid the situation entirely. We always want to be the last one to raise the level of force and the first one to bring it down whenever the opportunity presents itself. And this can happen like a roller coaster. It can go up and down many times in a given dynamic. Let's talk about some of the big arguments. Now, there was significant experiential evidence from the real world of individuals dying in police custody or during arrests. This became then supported by medical proof that suggested placing a subject on their front, on their torso in a prone position, can complicate escalated breathing, can complicate people in states of so-called excited delirium or people that are under the effects of drugs or even just heightened emotional states, and can increase the risk of what is termed positional asphyxia, which is death or asphyxiation because of a position. There has, as a backlash, been some effort by police and by researchers to show that these positions are entirely safe. So for all of the evidence out there indicating that it's dangerous, you will have law enforcement pundits indicating that it's entirely safe. In response to this, I will say a few things. Number one, the world of law enforcement justification is heavily political. If we extract ourselves from the restraint perspective and we look at objective studies on health, for example, we look at surgical journals. Whenever possible, surgeons will always seek to prioritize operating on somebody on their back. And they will only very rarely put somebody in a prone position on their face, on their stomach, in order to access the back. Whenever they can go through the front, even spinal surgery might go through the throat. But whenever it's absolutely impossible, they will only then put them on the front. The reason for that is that the research clearly shows there is an effect. There is a reduction of respiratory capacity. There are changes to autonomic function, parasympathetic nervous system, etc. If we look at research on sleeping patterns, it is quite clear, with very rare exceptions for small periods of time, if we are sleeping on our front in a prone position, again, breath, heart rate, immune function, parasympathetic nervous system, all get impaired. Yes, there are some exceptions. If you have a pregnant woman with hyperclampsia and the blood pressure is too high, brief periods of being in a modified prone position can benefit by taking the blood pressure down. But even in those cases, sleeping is not advised. So we can find research across the medical spectrum indicating that going onto your front makes breathing and circulation difficult. Now, one thing you can do very simply to have firsthand experience is to elevate your heart rate, do some jumping jacks, do some burpees, some dive bombers, and then lay down on your stomach. And then do them again and lay down on your back. Do them again and lay down on your stomach. And as you escalate, you can get a very clear comparative between being on your front and being on your back. In law enforcement and security training, I've seen time and time again people that are in otherwise perfect health going onto their front in a handcuff position or a simple arrest, panicking. I've seen asthma attacks triggered. I've seen psychologically people get triggered. So for me, there is no question that putting somebody on their front is tougher. Now, does it make our job easier for an arrest? Absolutely. There's no question if I can kneel on your neck and drive you face down on the ground, that's an easier day for me. So I understand the temptation for law enforcement officers to want to do it. And having been an interventionist and been in hundreds of scenarios, I'm going to tell you honestly, I've used a lot of prone arrest positions. I've used a lot of vascular restraint. I've knelt on people, spiked them in the back. I'm not discounting your safety. I'm not naively saying we have to pursue this ideal even though it's placing you at risk. The last thing I'm seeking to do is place our interventionist at risk. So yes, it is more complicated, and yes, we need to be even more reluctant about entering, which I think is a good thing. But there are still some very functional things we can do. If all else fails, would you have an argument to put the person on the front? Of course, you could, or else clear and take distance. There are circumstances where you still may need to put somebody on their front, but we need to be much less cavalier about this than we are. Moreover, people will see this idea of trunk restraint, and they'll say, well, his hands are both free. There are ways we can occupy the hands, as we'll see. Even if I approach solo and I grab one limb, yes, there are small joint manipulations that I can use that might affect him with pain. But people still have full mobility in their other limb, their legs, and most importantly, in their body. The engineer Sergei Grakovetsky quite clearly showed that the spine is the engine of all movement. A person with no arms and no legs is still capable of moving, of rolling over. In fact, we develop from the spine outward in the womb. As babies, we learn to control our spine first, then functionalize our limbs. And as humans, our resistance, our torque, our power originates in the spine always. So if we fail to control the spine, the limbs really are going to have free rein to do whatever they want. If we have great control of the spine, the strikes from the limbs tend to be weaker, and there are still ways, as we'll see, that we can mitigate those and smother them, largely to a huge extent. Okay guys, now if key principle number one of our approach to restraint tactics is to do everything that we can to prioritize not putting a subject into a prone position, face down, but rather trying to focus on sitting them down or else putting them on their back in a supine position, then our second most essential principle is to work on gross motor rather than fine motor technique. Meaning we go for the trunk, we go for the body, we go for the torso, rather than attacking the wrists and the elbows and doing small joint and finger locks. Now, I have taught defensive tactics for over 25 years. I've encountered many different approaches. I've encountered many different instructors. And what I can tell you is that in the vast majority of traditional approaches, there is a huge disproportionate amount of focus placed on small joint manipulation. So people will often argue, yeah, but that's what I know. Or, if it's not good, why is it there? Why is it in traditional battlefield jiu-jitsu? And certainly much of this does hail from battlefield jiu-jitsu, as we'll see. Now, if we go back to traditional jiu-jitsu, in traditional jiu-jitsu, one of the things that a samurai had to contend with is obviously being unarmed against a weapon. Not an ideal circumstance, formidable and terrible. If you take something of sword length, like this handbow, right? Something of sword length and somebody's swinging at you, arguably, the subject with that weapon is going to have disproportionate amounts of fixation on that weapon. Meaning that if they miss you, they're going to wrestle and try to get their hands back. And there are whole sub-schools and strategies for learning how to cut and retain and all of the rest of it. But there is a risk, a less trained person or a panicked person will fixate on it. And that fixation can make it a slight bit easier, give you a little bit of a larger window to work against the wholeness of the body just by using the wrist. If we're dealing with something like a sword or a spear, we acquire somebody's wrists, there is also a whole extra amount of leverage that is working against your wrist. If I take a fisted opponent and I try to turn their wrist outward, I only have the natural leverage inherent in the wrist. But if they're holding something heavy like a long stick, a sword, or a spear, now as I turn it, I have all of this counterbalance weight working in my favor against the wielder. So there is fixation and there is more leverage. But third, and this is a point that's often overlooked, not all traditional jiu-jitsu systems placed huge emphasis on fine motor control and small joint control. If you look back at texts going back to the 1600s, you will see huge amounts of emphasis on getting past the weapon, going behind the subject's rear diagonal flank corner, choking, controlling the head, steering the head, taking the wholeness of the body down. If the arm is attached to, very often it's very similar or akin to a wrestler's 2-on-1, there's ramming and tackling and sweeping and throwing. Very rarely in these systems do we see tons of fine motor control. Certainly those types of waza, those techniques, those tricks, if you will, are included in every style of jiu-jitsu. But where we see them really coming to dominance is after the 1850s, 1860s. the further distanced the samurai became from battlefield, the more we see ideologies. We see the rise of things like Akijitsu, which is more concerned with harmony and circularity and flow. Aikido certainly had a huge role in this. And there you will see this ideological pursuit of small joint manipulation in greater amounts. The traditional jiu-jitsus that I learned from all the different teachers certainly had an inclusion of small joint manipulation, but they were never the focus. And my teachers were all quite clear that small joint takes much more effort to become good and is much less used in reality. They were like a cherry on the sundae. You control the wholeness of the being, but the grip is still persistent. You have time for small joint. Somebody's resisting or holding on, you control all of them, possibly small joint assists. Small joint was always an extra. It was very rarely the first thing we would grab and twist off, but this is so often how it's being taught. Then flash forward to the beginning of the 20th century. The Japanese have this formidable army. The Americans look to create their own defensive combative systems. They look very much to the Japanese. They become hugely influenced by arts like jiu-jitsu, karate, and judo. And there we see the attempt to teach these wrist turnovers and small joint locks as very quick tricks in combative system. But the reality is, guys, learning something like that very fast and then making it work is tough. Something like a judo throw is easy to learn technically, but it's extremely hard to master and pull off. Otherwise, you'd be seeing judoka in the Olympics whipping them off readily back and forth on each other. It is a very rare thing when it's done purely and neatly. It's tough and it takes a lifetime of training. Small joint manipulation has its place, but when I see the majority of law enforcement curriculums focusing on this, I will only tell you that they're not impossible. They're just improbable. And they're way more improbable when we're investing less and less budget, less and less time, less and less money on training our subjects. I cannot imagine giving a 10 or a 20-hour defensive tactics curriculum and including small joint manipulation. And while I understand it seems to assist things like handcuffing and subject control, if you don't know how to wrestle, if you don't know how to control the trunk and the neck and the hips of a subject, you're never going to get to those small joints in the first place. So when we are teaching restraint tactics, small joint is a much higher tier of control. Because if you don't fundamentally understand how to control the torso, and you don't understand how to take the subject into a position of relative control, you're probably never going to get to the go-to. You're probably never going to get to try to use those small joint locks. We also know that from performance research, fine motor skills erode. And it is possible under stress to learn how to become better at fine motor skill, like loading a gun and chambering it and aiming. Those are all fine motor skills, but they require a lot of pressure testing to become efficient at under stress and application. So expecting our officers or our interventionists to take a week course on basic restraint, to make it heavy on small joint manipulation, and then to expect them to go out in the world against much larger pain-resistant subjects and to apply small joint is simply delusional, and it's ridiculous. So for these reasons, we look at the tested and true results that we've seen in wrestling systems throughout the world. Go for the trunk first, master the trunk, and then if the limb or the leaf, if you will, the fingers and the hands are available, then we can use those as additional skills. A third, rather self-evident but sometimes overlooked component of our approach to restraint is that we want to work with a subject's reflexes, with their more natural desires, which is to sit down. Everybody maintains some capacity to sit down. Even the oldest person you can encounter with limited mobility will have some flexion, and with a bit of assistance, they'll be able to sit down and to get up onto a seat, onto a chair, and with a bit more help, possibly onto the ground. But the ability to engage the ground face first is something that is extremely difficult for most adults. You take somebody past puberty and ask them to voluntarily lay down on their face, and they'll see a lot of consideration and lack of familiarity and plotting out of the movement. It's not something that we do every day. We do, however, stand and sit hundreds of times a day. We spend time sitting, watching TV, working in schools and offices. We get up, we go down. It is a natural, high probability, familiar mobility spectrum. But ground engagement via the front is something that is extremely important for mobility improvement, for amelioration of biomechanics, but it's something that most people do not spend time doing. And in fact, as Thomas Hanna said, the older we get, the more we fear the ground. And you see older people walking with this consideration of breaking a hip or a knee, and it becomes this constant battle between them and gravity, right? And that's a very real and dreadful fear. And if you look at studies on falls among the elderly, among the geriatric population, comparatives between frontal and lateral and rear falls, there are differences. We know that falling forward, you're more likely to hurt your head, you're more likely to injure your hands and to injure your knees, because that's how the body will collapse. Falling backwards unassisted, you're more likely to hurt your hands and possibly the hip bone or the buttocks. So even as a comparative between those two, if we weren't present, falling back on your butt is less likely to hurt your head on your own accord, on the ice. And it's more likely to hurt the hips and the butt, which is a bit more durable, which is far less breakable than something like a kneecap. Falling forward tends to have more force than falling backwards. And when we look at something like a harness, it's far easier for even a small person to take a larger person and to take their weight onto your body and to introduce it to the ground, to at least airbag it and reduce the amount of impact that you'll have. In my life of performing harness training in defensive tactics circles with complete new recruits, I'm talking thousands, just at the Montreal airport in a 5-year period, I certified or recertified over 6,000 times. So we're talking 6,000 individuals going through those classes. I've done it with military, I've done it with private security companies, and I've done it in my dojo for 25 years. I've never had anybody have an injury on a mat worse than a bruised tailbone. Ever. But I have in security training, when teaching forward pushing drills, had broken teeth, sprained wrists, injured fingers, broken fingers, dislocated elbows, dislocated shoulders. Even in the safety of training, in a padded environment, forward pressure, forward anti-reflexive efforts to make somebody go to the ground. Even if you're telling them to go one side first after the other, one knee down first, giving clear verbal commands, it becomes a soupy mess in application. And then when you have two officers, although there are strategies to mitigate it and to make it safer, very often lines get crossed and it becomes a mess. With a harness, if you're alone, it's much simpler to control somebody and to bring them down. With a harness, if you have interference and support officers go the wrong way, you are going to tend to win anyway. The backward sitting of the harness is more likely to win if somebody else is trying to pull you forward by an arm and everyone gets pulled down to the seat of the subject. So the third and most important reason why we go for harness and trunk control over fine joint manipulation is that it works with our more natural, used and familiar reflexes and range of mobility. We sit them down rather than drive them forward on their face.